Hi, my name is Ellie Heinen, and I am a business development specialist currently. I am presenting my capstone project for Savvy Coders Data Analytics and Python, and as you can see, my title is Fibromyalgia, Autism, and Sensory Sensitivity. So we are going to cover those three things, and I chose those topics because I've been diagnosed with fibromyalgia. I am on the autism spectrum and I experience sensory sensitivity, so this is something near and dear to my life, and I wanted to know more about it for reasons that I will go into soon. So first, I do want to just do an introductory glance at these three things, since they're going to be very important later. What is fibromyalgia? It is a rheumatic disorder. You often experience pain, fatigue, and cognitive difficulties with fibromyalgia. The definitive cause is still unknown. It has something to do with the nervous system, possibly also the immune system. It acts a lot like an autoimmune disease. It is pretty common. It affects up to 5% of the population. It affects mostly women, and it's often accompanied by sensory sensitivity. So not every person with fibromyalgia experiences sensory sensitivity, but it is fairly common to see sensory sensitivity with fibromyalgia. I personally also experienced that. And then what is autism? It's also known as autism spectrum disorder, or ASD. There are some outdated terms out there like Asperger's. In this presentation, I'm just going to refer to it as autism or ASD. It is a neurodevelopmental disorder. You often see things like difficulty with communication or socialization, restricted interest, so being interested in one thing and maybe not other things, and repetitive behaviors like hand waving or rocking back and forth. In the autism community, it's often called stimming. And another interesting thing about autism that it has in common with fibromyalgia is that the definitive cause is still not known. Most people agree that there's an environmental and a genetic factor, but it's still not clear exactly how those go together or what within the nervous system actually causes autism. It's more rare than fibromyalgia. It only affects about 1% of the population, but like fibromyalgia, it is often accompanied by sensory sensitivity. So these two things do have a lot in common. And if you're wondering, why do we still not know when we've made so many advances in science, especially medical science? Autism is obviously a marginalized disorder, and fibromyalgia affects primarily women. I think 80 or 90% of people with fibromyalgia are women. So both of them are historically under-researched, which is why data and studies like the one I'm going to talk about are so important. And then sensory sensitivity. We saw that it crops up in both autism and fibromyalgia. So what is it? It is a trait characterized by deep awareness of and sensitivity to stimuli of any kind. So physical stimuli, being touched, rubbed, certain textures, social stimuli, so being in a crowded room or in an awkward social situation, and emotional stimuli. All of your, range of emotions from sadness, happiness, anger, all of those things. So deeper awareness of insensitivity to those things. And again, the cause of this is also unknown. It probably has something to do with the central nervous system. So that's something that fibromyalgia, autism, and sensory sensitivity all have in common. They all affect the nervous system. And it's actually pretty common. It could affect up to 16% of the population. And all three of these disorders are part of a larger cluster of disorders, which also includes ADHD, sleep disorders, schizophrenia, brain injuries, IBS, which is a disease of the intestine. There's this whole cluster, and a lot of them are comorbid. They crop up together, and it's still unclear why. So I want to just talk about comorbidity really briefly. That just means that people are often diagnosed with them together. So if someone has one of these things, if you have ADHD, you're more likely than the average person to have another one of these things. So I have several of these diagnoses. Like I said, I've been diagnosed with fibromyalgia, and it's understood that figuring out, what the relationship between all of them is probably has something to do with the root cause. So looking at the relationship is a big step in trying to figure out what the cause of these things are and hopefully for treatment, because most of these things do not have a cure. So my question specifically, because we're data analysts, have to have a very specific scope and question, is how strong is the correlation between fibromyalgia and what this study calls autistic-like sensory processing issues? So we talk about in the chronic illness community a lot about there being this relationship, but I want to see it quantified. I want to know if it exists, and if it exists, how strong it is. Briefly, I want to talk about Agile and Scrum, because they defined the way that I approach this entire thing. I actually do Agile with my work. I work for a technology company, so I'm the Scrum Master as of today for the next sprint. We do 2-week sprints. We do daily stand-ups, and then in between sprints, so today we did a retro and sprint planning. In my personal life, I actually use Jira to manage all of the aspects of my life. I organize all of my to-do lists into epics and stories, and I do daily stand-ups with myself. So that's what this screenshot is here, is from my own personal Jira. And then with Savvy Coders, we got to use it in a completely different way to hold each other accountable for our Capstone projects. And I think that that really is the biggest advantage of Agile methodology, is that it gives you a forum for asking questions, holding yourself accountable, and holding other people accountable. And in a traditional stand-up, every single person says what they did that day. And so you really have to be honest with yourself and be honest with your team about what you're making progress in and what you're not. And I think that was a huge help for the Capstone, because it kept me on pace. And now I will be Agile certified as of graduation, which is really exciting. So the data set. What data set did I find? It is 399 participants, so 399 people, divided into 2 groups. A control group of people who do not have fibromyalgia, and a group of people who do have fibromyalgia. So one interesting thing to note, because no data set is perfect, and I want to point out the limitations of this data set, is that the control group is significantly smaller than the group of people with fibromyalgia. It's already a small group. 399 people is not that many people. And I looked, but I don't know, if they took an adequate sample of the population. So there are a lot of limitations with this. So we're just going to have a lot of caveats going into it, which is fine. So for every row, we had a column telling us which group they belong to, their sex, their age, and then 3 scores. So these 3 tests are really important, because this is what I'm basing my hypothesis and my conclusion off of. The first one is called CSI score. It stands for Central Sensitization Inventory. It is designed to detect disorders like fibromyalgia. So I'm going to conflate it with fibromyalgia a little bit, and we're going to treat it as a measure of sort of the severity of someone's fibromyalgia, or fibromyalgia-like symptoms. And then there is the SPS test, which is designed to detect sensory processing sensitivity that we talked about earlier. And then the Autism Spectrum Quotient test, or SAT. I don't know why the abbreviation is different than the actual letters that are used to spell it, but it's designed to detect autism, or ASD. So just to briefly go over it, CSI score, designed to detect fibromyalgia. Sensory processing sensitivity test, SPS, designed to detect SPS. And then SAT is designed to detect autism. So I'm mostly really interested in the sensory processing sensitivity test, because that is the thing that, based on my personal experience and the experience of people in the chronic illness community, a lot of these disorders have in common. So fibromyalgia and autism both are comorbid with sensory processing sensitivity. So I want to know, what is the correlation between those things like? So my hypothesis was that there will be a strong correlation between having fibromyalgia, so what group you're in, whether you're in the control group or having fibromyalgia group, and scoring higher on both the SAT and the SPS tests. It was a very, very clean data set. The the biggest thing was that it had a column for every single individual answer for every single test. So that was dozens of columns I didn't need, but I used Excel and I deleted them. There was also a column for socioeconomic status, and as tempting as that was to keep, it is not within the scope of this question, so I got rid of that. You can see my dirty data here. I also changed the column names because they were full of weird characters and too long, and it just wasn't easy, especially in SQL. And another interesting thing is originally this column was called group. That's whether you have fibromyalgia or do not have fibromyalgia, right? If you're in the control group or the other group. But SQL does not like using the word group casually. It doesn't compute that. So I changed that word to cohort because for all intents and purposes, that's the same thing. So just keep that in mind. And then I used pandas in Python just to check for null values and duplicates, which, like I said, this is a very clean data set, so there weren't any. So that was cleaning. And then as far as data exploration, I started in Excel just to get a really general view of the data. I calculated the averages of the scores and then the mins and the maxes, just to give me an idea of kind of what the scores looked like in the control group versus in the group with fibromyalgia. So you can see on the left is the control group here, on the right is the group with fibromyalgia. And at this point already you can see the group with fibromyalgia scored higher on every single test on average. And then I went ahead and calculated the percent change between the fibromyalgia group score over the control group score. So on average, the group with fibromyalgia scored 50% higher on the CSI test than the control group, which we would expect because CSI, if you recall, is a test to detect fibromyalgia. So that makes sense. But then we also see that the group with fibromyalgia scored about 33 to 35% higher on the SAT and the SPS as well. So we have questions. We'll save those for in a minute, but I do want to mention that I also went into SQL, into the database browser, and I just made some queries with multiple variables. So here I was querying by cohort and gender. Like I said, fibromyalgia predominantly affects women, so sex is always an interesting factor to bring in. And then in Jupyter Notebook, using Python and pandas, I made some pie charts just to kind of give me a visualization of some of the test scores. So this is just an example of one. I believe this was from the control group, and this is their CSI scores. So you can see that most of the people, well, not quite most, almost most, a good chunk of the people in the control group scored in the 40 to 60-ish range here, and then also a lot in the 20 to 40-ish range. So that just gives me my bearings kind of with the test scores. And then the most important thing I did probably in Python was I used pandas to calculate the correlation value for some of these columns with other columns, because that was my question, right, is how strong is the correlation between some of these things. So pandas has an awesome function for doing that. You can also do it in R and NumPy, I believe. So that was incredibly useful. And I'm going to talk about the correlations that I found. So the cohort with fibromyalgia, like I said, scored higher on average across all three tests. And you can see that in this visualization, right? This is the average CSI score. And this pink bar here is the cohort with fibromyalgia, cohort 1. And then this is the SAT score, same, it is slightly higher, and then same with the SPS score. But then we have the actual correlation values. And the correlation between cohort, so whether or not someone has fibromyalgia, and their CSI score was 0.82. And by convention of data analysis, 0.82 is a very strong correlation, which again doesn't surprise us because that test is designed to detect fibromyalgia. So it's great that it has a very strong correlation. The higher your score is, the more likely you are to have fibromyalgia. The correlation between cohort and their SAT score, the score designed to detect autism, was 0.37. That's a weak correlation. To be honest, that surprised me a little bit. And then the correlation between cohort and SPS score was 0.56. That is a moderate correlation. And that's probably the one that's most interesting to me, because this sensory processing sensitivity is this sort of mysterious thing that autism and fibromyalgia have in common. So I wanted to know, how strongly it actually did correlate with fibromyalgia. And it's a moderate correlation, which, right, as a data analyst is kind of frustrating. What do you do with moderate? But I think there are some things we can glean from that. Here's another way of looking at it. So on this axis, the x-axis here, I have SPS total, versus on the y-axis we have CSI total. So we can kind of take that to mean the higher you score on the tests for fibromyalgia, the higher you typically will end up scoring on the test for sensory processing sensitivity. And I included the trend line, you can see it here. And then if you look, these purple dots, these are all cohort 0, which is the control group, right? So the people without fibromyalgia. And they're all in this corner, right, with lower CSI totals and the lower SPS totals. There are, of course, outliers. And then we have the cohort 1, the group of people with fibromyalgia, clustered up here in pink circles. Let's see. And then, so what can we take away from this, right? We have to understand that the scope is limited, but I would say that there is limited evidence of a correlation between having fibromyalgia and experiencing autism-like sensory issues. So experiencing sensory processing sensitivity. And that suggests to me that maybe fibromyalgia affects parts of the nervous system in similar ways to autism, but that maybe they don't have the same root cause. Because we do see that fibromyalgia and autism are both correlated with a higher SPS score, but they're not, at least based on this very limited sample, necessarily correlated strongly with each other. So what were the challenges I faced coming to these conclusions? Well, first, this wasn't my topic that I picked. My original topic was the correlation between socioeconomic success and zip code. And that is really interesting, and I'd still love to do that, but that is just, the scope is way too big. So my solution there was switch topics, as much as it hurt my pride a little bit. But then switching topics at the last minute became another challenge in and of itself. And my solution was just, all right, we're going to rest, and then we're going to do the capstone as quickly as we can. So I really came back from that and threw myself into the capstone. And I think it worked out. I had a really good time. One really specific challenge was making pie charts with pandas. And you might wonder, why did I try making pie charts in pandas? Why didn't I make them in Tableau? Because it's way easier to make them in Tableau. But I made them at a time when we hadn't learned Tableau yet. So I was just making pie charts with some of my basic data visualization in pandas, and that ended up just being really difficult. So my solution was consulting Max, which is the answer to a lot of things, and finding patterns in the examples online. So that's something that came up over and over when I was trying to write code that I wasn't very familiar with. You'll get examples online, but then you have to identify how that pattern applies to the specific challenge that you have or the specific thing that you're trying to write code for. And that's kind of the beauty of coding, is solving the problem, loving the problem. So I did really enjoy that, even though it was a challenge sometimes. And then I would say my biggest frustration was only being able to draw really limited conclusions. Because being realistic, this data set only has 399 participants. All of these test scores are self-reported. I don't know where exactly this data set came from, as in I don't know what the methodology for collecting it was. I don't know a lot of things. And the one column it doesn't have that I think was just essential was whether or not the person was diagnosed with autism. So that's a huge missing part, right? But it's important to remember that limiting the scope of your analysis is part of what gives you integrity as an analyst. We trust analysts to know where the scope of a question ends, where the scope of a data set ends. And so as frustrating as it is, I think I stated the conclusions that I can draw, and I have more questions, but hopefully I can find more data. So that brings me to where is this going to go from here? Well, just kidding. Oh, there we go. Okay, I thought this slide got deleted. I would love to find more data about this because for me, this is personal. I have talked about it very impersonally, right? This score and that score, but for me, this is why do I experience this? Why is my health like this? Why is my body and my mind like this? So I have big questions. I need a lot of data, and I'm hoping that now I have the skills to find and use that data to draw stronger conclusions that are more definitive and maybe more actionable. I'm in the unique position that I already work for a technology company and will probably be put into a data analysis position at some point. So that is in the near future. When I think about, further down the line, what I want to do with my career, I really enjoy generative AI and natural language processing, but this project has shown me that there is so much potential for data-driven diagnosis. And currently, a lot of diagnosis just goes directly through physicians, and that is a huge challenge because physicians are people with biases. And data also, obviously, can be biased, but I see a future where we can mitigate some of those biases, and I would like to be a part of that using data. And then on a personal note, I think that this has sort of shown me that I need to advocate further for myself, maybe getting an official ASD diagnosis. And if there's one thing that I would love everyone to take away from this conversation, it's that if you experience any of these clustered disorders, be your own health advocate, because these, all of this is still murky. It's still poorly understood. And especially for women, we're navigating a system that is imperfect. And until we get better answers, we really have to speak up for ourselves and our experience. And I'm hoping that I can be part of that movement to convert some of those experiences into meaningful data.